Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a little bit more about Avengers Infinity War. It's time for my full analysis where I will talk about production as well as story and general effect. I'm going to be giving scores for lots of these categories. However, I will avoid giving an entire average score for this movie, and that's because I don't think it's fair to apply this system as it is directly to Infinity War. This Avengers movie is really more of a capstone experience to the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe than it is a movie in and of itself. And what I mean by that is that it's highly reliant on all of the material that comes before it, and it also ties off a bunch of threads that came from that material that generated it. It's a bit more like a season or series finale of a TV show than a movie in and of itself. And because of its main concept employing all of the characters from the MCU in one big epic struggle against a bad guy we've had built up for several years in the MCU. Because of that concept, it sacrifices certain things, particularly with the plot elements of the story, in order to achieve the concept and in order to fulfill fan expectations. So if I were to apply the system directly, it might lower the score more than what its effect would be for a typical audience member and fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I'm going to give some individual evaluations, but I'll skip the evaluation in total. Let's start with the big umbrella of production, which involves all the elements that make the movie work, which aren't the story in essence. So let's start with aesthetics. This is primarily the visual design of the movie. I give the aesthetics a 7 out of 10, and if you're thinking that score might be a little bit low, let me explain. While the visual design as a whole is definitely on point, it's such a strong mix of different and diverse styles that it feels more like a highlight reel of the other movies than something in and of itself. They're a little too disjointed. The one exception, though, to the high quality of each of those individual parts is, in my opinion, the design of Thanos, the primary villain in the movie. His costume and face have changed really dramatically from how we've seen him in past movies, going from something that was really frightening and otherworldly to something that's very soft and very human. Clearly, the filmmakers intended Thanos to be a highly sympathetic villain and tried to make his face more relatable and more human, capable of expressing sadness as well as anger and hatred. However, the end result is something that falls a little bit into the uncanny valley, and he ends up looking more like a big purple Homer Simpson than a frightening, unstoppable alien force bent on universal annihilation. Ultimately, I think Thanos' design had a purpose, which was to make him look more human, but that resulted in something that was a little bit less intimidating than I think would have been maximally effective for this particular movie. Let's move on to effects and cinematography. I give the effects and cinematography actually a 9 out of 10. This movie promises big CG action, and it definitely delivers on that. There's plenty of explosions, plenty of visual excitement and stimulation, and it is certainly a spectacle. The visual space is constantly packed with CG action, fights, alien ships, explosions, and even some good old-fashioned blood and guts. The big flaw in this part of the movie really comes to the style of cinematography and very, very fast-paced and tight editing that's involved with the movie, where sometimes the action happens so fast that it looks like a blurry stop show at 24 frames per second rather than a smooth action set piece or a smooth set of movements. And you can't tell what happened in some cases. It's just not clear enough. And I think we've kind of reaching the limitations of what 24 frames per second in a movie can deliver when you're editing things that tight. In some cases, there's action sequences that are like 8-10 frames, and that's not really enough time for us to take in and consider what's happened in terms of the action. So that's a little bit of a down point. That doesn't happen too often in the movie, though. Most of the time, we're able to clearly see what the action is, and we're able to be entertained by it and have a clear idea of how the action sequences are being executed and what's going on in any given scene. So nevertheless, even though there's a little bit of a flaw, it's a big-time spectacle movie, and that is probably why you would want to go see it in theaters. It's quite a visual feast overall. So sound design, I'm going to move on to sound design. I'm not giving this a number rating because I don't think I heard it correctly. Just like The Last Jedi, I've had this experience twice now in 2 different theaters, so I'm wondering if my doubts are real or not. My viewing of the movie featured really terrible sound. Like The Last Jedi, things were distorted and difficult to hear, particularly the dialogue. The vocal track, which is the center track in standard surround sound mixes, was slightly distorted, especially in the mid-range, about 2K, and was really flat and quiet for anything above 8K, making the speech really hard to recognize amid all the other noise. Most of the power of speech is in the high frequencies, and those felt really rolled off. The center channel felt dark, and I found myself having to kind of cup my ear in order to clearly hear what the dialogue was trying to say to me. And at the same time, while it was quiet, it was also kind of distorted. There was also not a big contrast between the loud and soft in most spaces, but I have to feel like Skywalker sound wasn't actually going to deliver a mix that was that bad. I have to believe that it was the theater, because I just don't see somebody spending $300 million on a movie and having a sound mix come out that was as bad as what I heard. I have to believe that the theater didn't have their sound system set up. Same thing with Last Jedi. I know that the sound design for Last Jedi had to be good, but I could hear that things were peaking on the theater sound system, that it hadn't been correctly calibrated in order to deliver the correct sound experience. So I'm going to skip giving that a particular rating. But if you experienced that same thing, if you thought the dialogue track was quiet and a little bit distorted, please leave me a comment down below, because I'd like to know if my experience is a result of some bad theaters that happen to exist around me physically, or if in fact this movie shipped in at least some copies with some bad sound. The sound effects as a whole were kind of flat as well, a little too compressed, and not a lot of life in the high end. It's a far cry from the quality of the first Avengers movie in terms of sound design, as well as any of the Star Wars movies in terms of the punch that it had. But they're good enough, and I think that I was probably experiencing the shortcomings of the system where I viewed the movie, and not really a bad shot from Skywalker sound itself. Music, I actually give the music an 8 out of 10. It was really refreshing to hear a good score. Alan Silvestri delivers a really good score with plenty of punch, memorable themes, and high amount of variety, which is great. And this is despite limited opportunity for the music to work within the blistering narrative pace of the movie. So a lot of those moments that you may have in older movies where the score can be heard clearly and it projects some emotion, not so many of those in this particular movie, and that's because of its incredible fast pacing. In fact, I think a lot of the drama of the film, when the movie actually slows down to deliver drama, is kind of as a result of this particular score. When it's finally able to speak, it really does a good job, and it fills in all the empty space of the narrative portions of this Avengers movie that exist in these moments of high emotion. And that's partly because of the concept of the movie, is that when we have a strong emotional moment, we're relying on a lot of our past memories of those characters from other movies rather than their development within the movie, and the score picks up a lot of that slack. Alan Silvestri definitely did a good job. I give it an 8 out of 10, and I think it was good memorable themes, and generally effective as it can be with a movie that has this amount of blistering action pace to it. Let's move on to story, the big category of story, which for me is going to include setting, characters, and plot. I'm going to start with setting. I'm not giving setting a rating because this movie is not about exposing the setting or developing the setting. It's about taking a setting that's been developed from so many movies and just having action happen in it. So the setting of the entire MCU is one of the big draws of this film for consumers, and the movie puts it on display almost as if it were hitting a checklist. It's got everything in it that you would expect from previous movies, or you want to see return from previous movies. The effect's a little bit opaque, but the subplot involving Guardians of the Galaxy also provides some real setting development, so there's a little bit of setting development there. And it also adds a little bit of lore interest to the movie that is otherwise absent in this sort of checklist. We got to go to Wakanda. We got to go to, Thor's planet. We got to show this. We don't go to Thor's planet. We go to a dwarf planet. There's lots of interesting little tidbits with the setting there, but it's more about relying on the development from previous movies. Let's move on to characters and dialogue. The movie wastes very little time in character development, which the concept of the film demands. When you have this many characters, it's going to be impossible to develop them. Instead, we get a snapshot of familiar characters before each of them begins the actions of the plot, and I thought that was effective and desirable considering the concept of the movie. We don't need a lot of development from these characters. We've seen them in previous movies. It's time to see them do their thing. There's a little bit of hammy dialogue and comic relief from the other movies, as you would expect, and there's some new matchups from different characters meeting and talking to each other. Most of it lands, a lot of it doesn't land, and there's a little bit of a dissonance between the intense despair and worry and anxiousness of this apocalyptic plot that's going on and the comic relief that happens to be happening. Sometimes at the wrong time. Sometimes the timing feels a little bit off. Most of it seems to be lumped in the first act, which is a good place to put it, but it no longer functions as comic relief once we get into the second and third act. The gravitas of Thanos and his plan, as well as the constant themes of sacrifice being demanded of all the characters, tends to make the comic relief a little bit unwanted. Thanos is the only character to get any real development, which should be expected because he's the only one who really needs it. And the redesigned Thanos is clearly intended to be a little bit more intimate and interesting than what the scary Thanos of the other movies was. And Josh Brolin actually does a superb job of acting out the stoic deviant. However, the transparent fallacies of his motivations, which I've talked about in another video here, hinder his relationship with the audience. And I should say, when I say the audience, I really mean me. Though I still think he remains a pretty frightening and formidable enemy through his actions more than his words or appearance or the flaws of his motivations. Make no mistake, Thanos is the real protagonist of Avengers. The plot goal of Avengers is Thanos' plot goal, not the Avengers' plot goal. They are reacting to Thanos. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in the second movie with his character and who's going to have the real plot goal there. My guess it's going to be Iron Man, and I'll explain that in a minute. So there's plenty of expositional dialogue as well, but you kind of need it in a movie like this, and that's kind of where characters are explaining something that should be obvious visually or should be known from previous movies. But because there's so much happening and it's going so fast, it's a little bit necessary so you can keep most of the audience on track with you. It wouldn't be necessary for me in most cases, but there's plenty of people who don't remember the other movies probably as clearly as I do, and so I'm okay with that bit of sacrifice. Overall, if I were to give the characters and dialogue a score, I guess I'd say it's a 7 out of 10. It's our classic favorite characters. Thanos works pretty well. Dialogue's not that great, but it's okay. And the only flaw with the amount of characters is I don't think you can satisfy most fans. I think there's always going to be a little bit not enough screen time for somebody's favorite character. But that's, again, one of the shortcomings of dealing with a limited time space. Maybe there'll be a director's cut that'll include more of the characters and more banter. Who knows? We'll see. Next, let's move on to plot. I actually give the plot a 4 out of 10. This is a pretty low score. I'll explain. So here's where the flaws of the concept of Infinity War really come home to harm the effect of the movie. They don't harm it that much, in my opinion, because of the way the concept actually works. And this is one of those things where it might not be fair to talk about how bad the plot is because the movie's not really reliant on a complex or interesting plot. It's really fulfilling a bunch of other goals from previous movies. There's simply too many heroes who need screen time, and the plot seems to be constructed as a means to show as many of them as possible to the audience within Thanos' main plot goal, which is, of course, to destroy all life or half of all life and prevent overpopulation in the universe. This means the first half of the movie is spent setting up coincidental meetings and alliances in order to get all the heroes to mingle and interact. You have Spider-Man shows up to help Iron Man. Hulk shows up as, sent by Loki and Thor. And he sort of shows up because he doesn't really become the Hulk. The Hulk refuses to come out and save the day. And I think they're saving that for the next movie. And he shows up to send news of the impending Thanos attack and thus begin the inciting incident of the plot, or continue the inciting incident of the plot, which was begun with Thanos attacking Thor's ship. We have Thor randomly meet the Guardians of the Galaxy, and they split up to randomly meet Iron Man and Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, while half of them end up in a different place talking to a giant Peter Dinklage, going on a quest to rebuild a better weapon for Thor, even though in the previous movie we kind of got the idea that Thor didn't really need his hammer, but he goes to essentially forge a new weapon. And eventually, once we're done getting all these meetups, we have to go find Captain America. He has to meet up with Vision. They have to end up in Wakanda. So once we've got all this stuff lined up, then finally we end up in the second and third act where things really kick into gear, and we can see Thanos achieving his plot goal of getting all the Infinity Stones and then hopefully using them to wipe out half of life everywhere. because of those combinations, you get some interesting things as well, which is like the entire army of Wakanda fighting Thanos' army of monsters. You have also in this plot, you have this constant theme of sacrifice, where Thanos, or just the plot, is asking the characters to sacrifice, to kill one character in order to stop Thanos' plot goal. So there's an opportunity to kill the Vision by destroying his Infinity Stone, that's essentially his mind, and stop Thanos from getting it. And they have the entire army of Wakanda fight so that they don't have to sacrifice that one person. And this may seem a little bit weird, I think, to some people watching it, but I think it's that there's this kind of moral conflict happening in the plot between Thanos, who views his horrible, horrible means as justified by the ends, the noble end he's trying to achieve, and the Avengers, or all the good guys, who really don't see a way of sacrificing something or doing something bad in order to achieve a good end as a moral or righteous thing. So you have the entire army of Wakanda fighting to protect the Vision, because it wouldn't be right to kill somebody simply because it would make things more convenient for you. So it's kind of interesting the way that they set that up, and I did appreciate that. Beyond this schizophrenic display, there's some actual attempts at plot work, especially in the second and third act. A lot of them fall a little bit flat because there's not enough time for us to dwell on them. There's this scene where Thor forges a new weapon. It happens almost too quickly, and there's some really unbelievable things that are done in order to achieve that. That setup of having to let people die to stop Thanos, nobody seems really willing to do it. When they are willing to do it, something stops them from being able to do it. Normally, that classic theme works pretty well. Unfortunately, they sidestep it a little too much, except for one important moment that I'll point out, which has to do with Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange agrees to trade an Infinity Stone to spare the life of Tony Stark, or Iron Man. This is, of course, a plot spoiler, if you will. He trades that to spare the life of Iron Man, which is different than sacrificing Iron Man to keep the stone. He was really quite willing to sacrifice himself in order to keep the stone hidden. But there's a previous scene where Doctor Strange is essentially looking into the future, and he looks at all the possible futures of what they're doing. He looks at like 1.6 million or something. And there's one where they have the outcome where they win. And so why would he trade the Infinity Stone to save a dying Stark? It's because that future is the only future where they win is one where Tony Stark's alive. So I expect the second movie, we have the closing of the cycle. For the second movie, we have the original Messiah from the very first MCU movie, the Iron Man movie, is going to essentially return and set things right. And that's what you're going to kind of see from the second movie, the second half of the cycle. So that's an interesting moment, I think, that's worth noting. And I think a lot of these moments with sacrifice are intended to show some of the weakness of the protagonists regarding how their attachments and their morals and the conflict that goes with those. They're a little bit contrived in most cases, and there's a lot of moments where, you know, somebody tries to jump up and kill Thanos, and it just doesn't seem to work. You get 4 or 5 of those, starting with Loki and going on, and you get a little bit tired of that same presentation over and over again. But it's an important theme, I guess, for the movie, so you can weigh it however you want to. By the end of the movie, Thanos completes his quest, and the hero's failures become total, and the cycle closes. You have a descent into darkness so that the heroes can rise again and set things right in the next movie. A lot of heroes die instantly, but I'm going to tell you right now, because of the way they died and because of this setup with Doctor Strange, I expect all of those deaths to be reversed in the second movie. That's a full expectation of mine. And part of this is a little bit more meta outside the movie. We have Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Black Panther. There's only one movie for each of them. They haven't milked those franchises enough. They're probably not going to kill them off for good and cash in their final checks, but I expect they might do that for Iron Man in the next movie, simply because I think Robert Downey Jr. might be done playing the character, or might be feeling like he's getting too old to do it. So that's my evaluation of the plot. It's a little bit schizophrenic. It's contrived, especially the first half of the movie. Once it kind of gets going, it ends up a little bit better. And all of these moments seem just kind of displaced from any kind of clear meaningful sequence of a plot. But I think you have to sacrifice this idea of a typical plot in order to achieve the concept of the movie. So take that with a big grain of salt. I actually don't think the plot, even though I'm giving it kind of a low score of 4, maybe I bump it up to 5. Even though I'm giving it kind of a low score, I don't view that as like a breaking point for this particular movie. It shouldn't stop most fans from enjoying the movie. Lastly, general effect. I actually give the general effect an 8 out of 10. It's hard to make a better case for a movie sacrificing story in favor of an ambitious concept than Infinity War, and it will probably be one of the few movies that actually pleases audience in that attempt. It's larger than life, overgrown, filled to the brim with your favorite characters doing exactly what you want them to do, and it actually succeeds in delivering a unique experience among its unbridled chaos. It's a movie for fans. It pulls no punches in that regard, and should be evaluated based on those merits. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me outside of YouTube for more. DavidVStewart.com, DVSPress.com, Facebook.com/DavidVStewart. If you want to drop me $1 or $2 on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/DavidVStewart if you found value with this or would like to give me some extra value. I will try to be giving some more value to Patreon besides just free access to my books in the future. So if you are interested in that, for $1, you can get some access to news stories that haven't been released yet, and we'll see what I can do with that particular feed. Thank you. Leave me your comments down below about what you felt about it. Overall, I thought it was a really wild experience, way over the top, and that's exactly what it should have been. Some things were sacrificed in order to make the concept work, and overall, I do think the concept works despite its flaws. So have a great one, and I'll see you next time.